Now, Chad, how about we go deep with Tim's question? He says, one for Coach Chad, and this is an interesting predicament of a question to consider. He says, can anaerobic efforts of 120 to 130% FTP and above, he's saying, result in a decreased lactate threshold due to the increased rate of glycolysis? I like how short this answer is. It's also high impact. There's a lot to consider in here. So Chad, so basically he's talking about, there are a lot of assumptions here. Or I should say there are assumptions that are made within this, and kind of like, if this, then that is basically what we have throughout this question. Mm-hmm. Where would you like to start with this one?
First off, I like to point out how fun these questions are, and that it's such a short question. There's just, it's a sentence. And probably this deep dive more than any other, the biggest challenge is typically the literature review, trying to do all the reading, process it, make sense of it, make notes, and then compile those notes. This one, none of that was nearly as stressful or challenging as trying to make this concise. I mean, I had probably 6, 7 rambling pages of information I had to whittle down to what I try to keep to 3 pages. And it was hard. It was super hard because there were so many things I wanted to expand on. There are a lot of things I learned over the course of this, but yeah. So these are my troubles. This is what I go through for you all, the sacrifices I make. But I whittled it down to, I think, what's relevant and important for people to understand, because I do think this is a very misunderstood topic. I think anytime an endurance athlete looks at anaerobic work, there's so many misconceptions that somehow just hang in there for decades. It's unbelievable. Okay, so to reiterate, or just let me restate the question. Can anaerobic efforts result in decreased lactate threshold due to increased rate of glycolysis? Okay, so the short answer, before we explain what all those things mean, just to let Tim off the hook if he wants to leave early, they could make you a more anaerobic athlete. This is possible. But the real question, and I think the question you're asking, is, would this harm your FTP? And maybe the realer question, if you'll permit it, is, would this hamper your performance? Because it really does just come down to performance. Who cares what the numbers say if you're performing better than you ever have? So let's begin with a brief discussion of endurance capacities. Now, endurance, there's a lot of capacities we can develop as cyclists, but we're looking at the endurance side of things, which really makes it just about 2: aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity. It is that simple. On the aerobic side of things, aerobic capacity is VO2 max. And that's typically the term we throw at it. And that's the maximum oxygen utilization, right? We've talked about this a million times. And it's typically measured per minute, milliliters per kilogram per minute, if we want to relate it to body weight, or just liters per minute, if we want to look at the absolute amount of oxygen pulled into the system. On the other side of things, anaerobic capacity, VO2 max, take out the O2, slot in LA for lactate, VLA max. So VLA max, if you ever see that term, that's what we're talking about, anaerobic capacity. And all this is the maximum lactate produced, and this is measured per second. We'll get back to that. But so on the aerobic side of things, it's the maximum utilization. On the anaerobic side of things, it's the maximum production. So when Tim talks about rate of glycolysis, or glycolytic rate, as it's often put, he's really just describing anaerobic capacity. And with respect to that measurement that I just mentioned, it's millimoles per liter per second. And you don't really need to get hung up on all of those. Just understand, for context, that say an Ironman competitor, and we're going to talk about this later, could have a glycolytic rate around 0.3, whereas a field sprinter at a high level could have a glycolytic rate way up at 0.9. So, wow. Those are the difference. That's just some comparison, right? The very low end
Profound
of things,
difference.
The very high end of things. It's substantial. It's hugely substantial. But the point is that if you increase your rate of glycolysis, you raise your anaerobic capacity. Okay, that's the simple of it. What's also important to understand before we move on to other topics is that aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity are not a seesaw relationship. It's not as though if you improve one, the other is negatively impacted, or vice versa. Rather, you can have simultaneous improvements in both. It's completely possible. You can raise your aerobic capacity and your anaerobic capacity at the same time. You're increasing your ability to both produce and metabolize lactate. You can have that. And it's a lot easier to come by earlier in your training trajectory than it is toward the end. And it's more impactful toward the end when you really need to be specific with how those two systems balance. Okay, so next we'll get to lactate threshold, but first, got to talk about lactate itself. And if you're a longtime listener of the podcast, you've undoubtedly heard me talk about George Brooks. He's been a PhD in this realm since, the early 70s, UC Berkeley. He's the man on this topic. And I'm sure there are other resources on the matter. I know there are, but man, I don't think anybody surpasses his contributions to the research on this particular topic. A couple of years ago, I came across an article in Science Daily, 2018, where he states or paraphrases, but he's basically, he lets us in on something that I think a lot of people miss. First off, lactate, it's a major fuel source. And I think that's pretty widely agreed upon, except in some amazingly resilient textbooks that still perpetuate
and cycling commentating
information. Oh, good Lord. Don't get me started. Don't get me started. I cringe. I have to
His muscles are flooded with lactate every time. It's like,
let's not go down that road.
Yeah. Sorry, cool. Chad.
Okay. So it's a major fuel source. It's the major material to support blood sugar level. So, blood glucose levels, and it's a powerful signal for metabolic adaptation to stress. And I've linked to that article there. I highly recommend that every endurance athlete out there, everyone listening, read it. It takes 5 minutes. It'll open your eyes in a number of respects, not just endurance performance, but all the wonderful things that lactate is responsible for and can do, and the directions the science is trending with it, et cetera. It's very interesting. Okay, so again, those three things: major fuel source, supports blood glucose control, and it's a powerful sign for metabolic adaptation to stress. These are hugely important to endurance athletes. I mean, they're of general importance to everybody, but especially to endurance athletes. What else is interesting about lactate is that it enters the bloodstream twice as fast as glucose, peaking at around 15 minutes versus the 30 minutes it takes for glucose to peak. Wow. That's rapid. And George Brooks actually had a hand in the development of Cytomax. We talked about Cytomax last week, and Jonathan noted how it's one of those that if he leaves in the fridge or leaves on his bike, he's got to dump it out. Yeah. And I think I might know why that is. I think it's because Cytomax actually included lactate. So in addition to the typical glucose and fructose that you'll get in every energy drink out there these days, George worked with Cytomax and they put a bit of lactate in it, which is super interesting because it's a hugely readily available resource and a preferred energy resource for so much of the body. But it didn't stick. And I question why that is. And I think I have my answer. No one wants to buy an energy performance or a performance enhancing energy supplement that has lactate listed on it. Right?
Yeah. Because it's got a bad brand, right?
It's got a bad brand, and people don't understand what it is. They think I'm trying to stave off lactate accumulation. Why would I contribute to the problem? So it's not very marketable. I really do think that's it, because scientifically it makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. So in continuation, what is lactate? It's one of the eventual byproducts of the anaerobic side of metabolism. So of anaerobic glycolysis. So really simply, bioenergetics lesson here, not going to go deep at all. Carbohydrate is introduced into the system, pulled out of the muscles, whatever. It's broken down into glucose. That glucose is then broken into pyruvate. That's as far as we'll go right now. If under certain circumstances it accumulates, it becomes lactate. Along with the lactate comes a hydrogen ion. And that hydrogen ion may sound insignificant or like a detail I need not include, but that hydrogen ion is typically what's credited for muscle burn these days. It's pretty agreed upon that lactate doesn't cause muscle burn. It's widely agreed upon amongst people who actually know what's going on. It just doesn't. It's a fuel. The hydrogen ions, however, are what can reduce our blood pH, increase our blood acidity. And in line with this little factotum, I'm linking to George Brooks' 2018 review. This is for the true nerds. If you want to go deep on something, and I'm telling you, you can lose months in this single paper, because the paper itself is complex and the numerous studies it lists to, you'll just go on and on and on. But if you have the time, there's a lot of good stuff in there. But the fact is that with higher levels of lactate, blood pH decreases. I'm not saying that the lactate causes a decrease. We know that it doesn't, but more lactate accumulates, blood acidity increases. Okay, muscle burn happens. And that's the acidosis that we all truly fear. It's acidosis that's one of, because muscle fatigue is a really complex beast, but acidosis is one of the affronts to homeostasis. Lactate is not. And interestingly, those hydrogen ions, it's argued they're not either. It's this whole crazy balance between lactate being negative, hydrogen being positive, then produced in a 1-to-1 ratio. They balance each other out. It's an interesting, again, check out that paper. It'll give you a million directions to go. Okay, so 2 important points on lactate to take away before we move on to lactate threshold is 1, it's constantly being produced at work and at rest. Sitting here right now, we're producing lactate, probably somewhere along the lines of 1 millimole per liter per kilogram, whatever it may be. I'm not entirely sure, but it's being produced right now. Secondly, 2 fates. It's either metabolized for energy or it becomes glucose again. Okay, that's basically the only 2 directions it goes. So now let's move on to lactate threshold. And lactate threshold is quite simply the highest intensity that an athlete can sustain without accumulating lactate in the blood. So like I said, at rest, we have lactate in our blood. We do a bit of work, that lactate level ramps up. As long as we level off our work effort or output level, it levels off. We've achieved a steady state. Do a bit more work and level off, lactate too will eventually level off. Keep on escalating the amount of work you're doing, it will eventually reach a tipping point where you can no longer attain a steady state. This is a threshold. This is where lactate is now being produced at a rate faster than we can clear it. So my preferred term is MLSS or max LAS. I just find it more descriptive because it's the maximum lactate steady state. We can attain a steady state. This is as much as we can tolerate. I like that term. Today, we're going to use lactate threshold, and it suffices perfectly. So no worries there. Okay, so this is the threshold between achieving that steady state and no longer leveling out. It's the physiological going on behind the measures. And our measures, when it comes to cycling, or our measure is FTP, functional threshold power. And all this is the power that occurs, the power that we can produce while this physiological going on is taking place in the background. So how much power can we produce when we're at lactate threshold? For runners, for swimmers, for kayakers, for any other type of endurance athlete, they'll probably use something like pace or speed at lactate threshold. That's kind of their anchor for the various training zones and types of workouts and et cetera. Okay, so there's lactate threshold. So now let's move on to what Tim terms rate of glycolysis. So glycolysis is simply, as I stated, the anaerobic metabolism of carbohydrate. So no oxygen required. This is how we break down sugar. And it yields those 2 pyruvate, but it also yields a couple ATP. So we get a little bit of energy and we get it really fast, which compounds to a lot of energy just really inefficiently, right? We blow through fuel stores really rapidly when we start dumping carbohydrate and processing it quickly because we're doing a lot of work. Now, other than the energy, the 2 ATP, those 2 pyruvate are what eventually goes into the mitochondria. And they yield a lot of energy, but they do it comparatively slowly. So instead of a couple ATP, now we get 34, 36. Some papers insist on 38 ATP. So it's not even comparable. It's a huge difference, but it happens slowly. So to sum all that up, carbohydrate into anaerobic metabolism yields a couple pyruvate, a couple ATP. Pyruvate into the mitochondria yields a lot of ATP, 34, 36 of them. Now from here forward, I'm not even going to talk about pyruvate. I'm just going to talk about lactate. And this was one of those topics that I wanted to include, but it just takes us off point. It's fun to talk about and understand and try to explain and make sense on the fly. But it's unnecessarily complex for the question that's being asked. So
this podcast is cross-country Olympic, not cross-country marathon.
Yeah, exactly. That's the goal anyway. Okay, so no more use of pyruvate. It's lactate. I mean, they're for our use today, they're synonymous. So training can increase our anaerobic capacity, right? You can increase the rate that you metabolize glycolysis, right? You can increase your glycolytic rate. In doing so, you're increasing your ability to produce lactate. But if the rate of glycolysis is too high or your anaerobic capacity is too low, and we'll get to that.
Aerobic capacity, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry, aerobic capacity is too low, then too much lactate accumulates. So it's basically you're accumulating it at too fast a rate for your mitochondria to process. Anaerobic system is outpacing the aerobic system. So this is going to happen regardless, right? Everyone's going to come up to a point where they simply can't level out anymore. They're going to push past that. And that's just the nature of hard work. But training can shift where this occurs. So training can actually determine where the balance between your aerobic system and your anaerobic system lies. Now, if you'll recall, I said lactate has 2 fates, right? It can be metabolized or it can be reconstituted, is the word I'm going to use, to glucose. So if you look at where it can go, first it can be, we accumulate a bunch of lactate, it can be shuttled off to neighboring cells. So an interchange between the slow twitch and the fast twitch, neighboring slow twitch, whatever. It can move from cell to cell to cell within a muscle. In there, it's metabolized for energy. It can accumulate and then spill into the blood, gets transported back to the liver, and then it's metabolized back into, or converted back into glucose. This is the Cori cycle, something we all probably learned about and subsequently forgot in high school. But that is a process that's known and important. It can be shuttled to other neighbors, organs, for instance, the brain, the heart. These are supposedly, according to Brooks and according to a lot of research, this is the preferred fuel source for these organs, for these neighbors. And again, it's metabolized for energy there. Are there other fates? Probably. I don't know, but let's get back to the balancing act. So when we train specifically, or when Tim, for instance, trains specifically to increase his anaerobic capacity, it carries consequences. Some of them are desirable, some are not. So pretty apparent that anaerobic metabolism requires a very specific fuel, carbohydrate. So in training up your anaerobic capacity, you're increasing your reliance on carbohydrate. Sounds all good and fine. I'll just eat more carbohydrate, but this incurs or brings with it greater nutritional challenges, especially over long durations. So welcome to the world, if you're not already indoctrinated into it, of carbohydrate loading. Higher intakes of carbohydrate, both pre, during, and post. Increased gut tolerance to go along with those higher levels of carbohydrate. Something I don't think a lot of people consider, but added expense. A lot of these products are pretty expensive. When you start using a lot of them, that expense just rises right along with its usage.
You start to become just as expensive as your car if you look at mileage.
Totally. Depending on the line of products you utilize, you can spend a lot of money on this stuff.
Yeah.
And then it affects your planning. Now you have to plan differently nutritionally because you're burning fuel at a different rate. So, and also potentially, if you overdevelop your glycolytic capacity, this is absolutely a thing that can happen. What happens? You get too high rate of glycolysis, which leads to too high rate of lactate production, which means a greater demand on your aerobic capacity. And this can all lead to greater lactate accumulation at lower power outputs. So now you're dumping lactate at less power than you used to.
This is kind of like the theory of, I mean, this is one of the things that are accomplished when you reset into a base phase, right? And into spending more time. Like this is one of the many goals of base training. Yeah,
absolutely correct. Okay, so how do we balance our anaerobic capacity and our aerobic capacity? And obviously, it's dependent on discipline. We have to consider what we're after, and what type of racer we need to be, where all those things. But also, you have to factor in our unique physiologies. Are you largely slow twitch or fast twitch driven? I mean, there's a genetic bias there. Your nutritional practices. Do you eat a ton of carbohydrate? Because that's going to influence how well you metabolize a ton of carbohydrate. And your strengths and weaknesses. And I mention this because I see it, maybe not often, but I see it. The athletes pursue improvements and they do so at the expense of impairments. So they chase one thing and don't recognize the detriment or the issues it's causing with other things. And maybe I'm looking at you, Tim. I don't know what type of athlete you are, but does it suit you to emphasize your anaerobic capacity? You may like those workouts, but is that going to make you a more successful athlete in terms of what you want to be good at, the events you partake in?
Kind of like Kai's question. Yeah. That we just answered, right? And like a lot of us, when we get into that season of racing or season of riding, when we maybe not race as much, maybe not train as much, just chase Strava KOMs. You know what I mean? Like that's the sort of thing. If you continue to do the same thing over and over like that, it can happen.
Yeah. And you plateau, or you start going backwards and you can't figure out why. I'm doing all this anaerobic work. I should be able to hang on to anything. And, initially for a little while, that's probably true, but eventually it's not going to be, because it all comes back to the aerobic system.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's do a quick rider comparison to kind of maybe put a little visual behind this. So let's take rider A and rider B. Rider A is an Ironman, an elite level Ironman competitor. Rider B, a high level criterium racer. Now they both weigh 75 kilograms. So they're both 165 pounds. They both have a 250 watt threshold. And you think, okay, they're the same rider. They have the same capabilities and they have the same capacity. So nothing could be further from the truth. They might, but they probably don't. And it could be a pretty wide disparity. So in the case of the Ironman competitor, I talked earlier about having a really low anaerobic capacity. So let's pin them at a 0.3, whereas the crit rider, maybe it's the sprinter on the team too, has a really high anaerobic capacity, way up at 0.9. So 3 times that of the IM competitor. The aerobic capacity and the VO2 max of the Ironman racer is 50 milliliters per minute. So 50, whereas the crit racer has a 63. So right here, we have the same FTP, very different capabilities. And as you'd expect, they have to train differently. The point here is that if you emphasize the wrong energy systems, you do so at your own peril. So
why specific training matters, right?
Yeah, it absolutely matters, especially as you get closer and closer to your important events. So this is different disciplines, right? Obviously, no one's going to train an Ironman competitor the same as they're going to train a criterium racer. But what if you look within the same discipline? So having just watched, or in the midst of watching Road World Championships right now, time trial was a couple of days ago, won't give anything away, but the juniors' fastest times were right around 26 minutes. Step up to the U23s, right around 34 minutes, longer course. Step up to the elites, way up at 48 minutes. So different energy demands within very similar events. The point is that you can intentionally make yourself more glycolytic. And in some cases, maybe that makes sense. Maybe the juniors, knowing they're only going to be out there for roughly 26 minutes, say, I'm going to go whole hog on the anaerobic training because there's going to be a bigger anaerobic contribution to an event that short. I'm going to lean into that. I would suspect not, because they're probably not just time trialists, they're probably road racers also. So while they do need to have some anaerobic capacity and capability, they're probably still mostly reliant on the aerobic side of things. But in most cases, and actually, sorry, that describes most cases, all of us as endurance athletes should primarily focus on increasing our aerobic capacity. And in doing so, that helps us prevent the lactate accumulation that we're trying to avoid. Put it another way, you adjust this anaerobic capacity based on the strength of your aerobic capacity. Build a big VO2 max first, then layer those glycolytic capabilities on top based on what type of athlete you are, what you want to be good at, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what you're built like physiologically, et cetera. So the overall takeaway here is train your aerobic capacity to its maximum. Do that first and foremost, and then adjust your anaerobic capacity to suit.
Awesome.
Okay, which brings us to the final little bit of information. So how do we assess or measure and then track changes in both of these capacities? Well, a couple ways you can do it, probably several. I'm going to give you a couple. One is you can measure and track your oxygen uptake and your lactate levels on the reg. Got to do it consistently, right? If we're trying to track changes, you can't do it every once in a while. It's got to be pretty consistently pinned down. You can do this in a lab. You can do it on your own. You can buy a VO2 max mask. You can buy a lactate machine. You can use software that calculates it. These are all things that are available and you can do it, but this puts it on you. Add to that, these improved measures, so increase in oxygen uptake, increase in lactate production, don't necessarily jibe with improved performance. The only true measure of performance is performance. You can have an increased FTP, you can have an increased VO2 max, an increased VLA max. You can have all those things, but does it make you faster when you need to be faster? Do you perform better in your important events? So my suggestion is the alternative to this, is that you track changes with performance itself. Focus less on your aerobic capacity, your anaerobic capacity, even your FTP. Gasp, I know. Use adaptive training. Then it's on us. We got you, right? Do discipline specific, phase dependent, going to move you through base, build, and specialty. Successfully complete your workouts and get served more demanding, more specific workouts. All the while, you're targeting continually improved performance. To put that another way, you let your actual performances guide you. Use the workouts themselves as their own measures of improvement.
That's such an important point. It's so easy to get caught up in the numbers for all of us. This was actually a takeaway from James Dunleap's podcast, the Successful Athletes podcast we did. He's a data analyst. And for him, cycling just sucked him in, right? It was like, who I can measure absolutely everything. And that lent to this issue that he was talking about with managing mental health with the sport as well. Now he's to a point where he just commits to, he says, I know that I like to be able to train this much and I train this much and I don't pay attention to the numbers. Obviously, when I'm training, I hit my targets. That's what I do there. But I'm not trying to measure absolutely everything to try to find something that's confirming what I'm doing. Instead, I just let the performance lead. And that's the move forward. And that's the big reason we could have structured adaptive training in so many different ways. And that's why we went after performance and letting an athlete's performance on a workout serve as the indication of where they're at, rather than trying to come up with new fancy metrics or anything else like that.
So consider one benefit of that is when you show up at a race I mean, you don't have to, well, all my numbers are good, so I should be able to do well today. Rather, all my workouts that are just like the race I'm about to do have been good, so I know I'm going to be good today.
Yeah, huge difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
You aren't bridging that gap between numbers and hoping that the context hits. You've already been doing the context. It's there.
Exactly.
Chad, this was awesome. I'm going to recap this. So basically, to train specific energy systems or train specific energy systems by training specific capacity. Right? So when we're talking about, if you're looking at anaerobic and aerobic and we're looking at the trade-offs there, well, if you train one or the other, you'll get the benefits that you get. The early goal with a lot of this training is to maximize your energy production in general. And then later on, it's more specific. So base, build, and specialty. That's when we talk about, like Pete, that's when he's working on being able to attack over and over and over again, or attack and sustain like you would in something like a breakaway pace line, something like that. That's where the specificity starts to come in. But striking the balance is really where it comes down to finding ideal performance, right? So it's making sure that you're doing the right things there. Endurance athletes can't be so like one-dimensional that you just focus on one sort of training and then you expect that to deliver you performance on race day. Specificity is something that's supported by a broad range of training that ends up being an athlete, in a spot where they're actually prepared to be able to take off and perform well. It's complex if you try to balance all of that, but that's why you go through the process of finding structured training plans that are built out for it. I mean, we all have trained to a certain point. I think all of us, even to here at times, we think, I probably know what's best this week. But many times it's easy to find us off the rails if we deviate from good principles. So structured training will get you to the point where you don't have to worry about this give and take, Tim, where you're worried that really high intensity anaerobic work is going to be harming something else. You don't have to worry about that. And yes, while doing that could effectively influence your lactate threshold in one way or another, if you're doing that aerobic work, you're balancing that out just the same. You're not causing any problems there. You're rising. True, the tide is rising all ships in that case. So don't have to worry about it. This is just like basically the answer with this one is, why is structured training important, right? We could have summed it up right there. So, Chad, thank you for doing all that research on that and digging into it. Super interesting to always talk about lactate in general. That's always a fascinating one because it's much maligned and badly branded.
If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up.
If you didn't like this video, you can give it a thumbs down, but let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below.
If you want to see more of these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, check out TrainerRoad.com.
Do it.